By 2018, I had been working at Domino's for 4 years. Being a pizza maker wasn't the job I envisioned myself having at 24, but I guess that's on me for dropping out of college when I did. My parents and I grew distant because of my life choices. Mom and Dad wanted me to become a lawyer, like my brother. I felt so pressured into being what they wanted me to be, and I eventually reached breaking point. My girlfriend Ruby made me realize that I didn't have to be the person they wanted me to be. I could be my own man and live my life the way I wanted to live it. Working at Domino's wasn't exactly a dream job of mine, but I was happy working there. My parents put too much strain on me, so I had to create some distance between us. When I did that, things became much clearer. I got along with most of my co-workers at Domino's, but there was one individual that made me feel very uncomfortable. Wesley Nolan was hired as our delivery guy in late 2017. From the first time we met, I always got a strange vibe from him. I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Wesley was a skinny, punk rock looking kind of dude. Both of his arms were covered in tattoo sleeves and his blonde streaked hair went all the way down to his shoulders. He clearly didn't like me, and I didn't know why. I endured his passive-aggressive comments and disgusted looks for a few months before finally confronting him one day. I wasn't usually a confrontational person, but I had enough of Wesley's weird mind games. I asked what his problem was. At first he acted like he didn't know what I was talking about. Then I called him a gutless coward, which seemed to set off some alarm in his head. Wesley, completely out of nowhere, accused me of stealing his girlfriend, and said I wasn't good enough for her. He then walked away, giving me no further explanation. To say that I was confused would be an understatement. Later that day, I called Ruby, and asked if she had dated a guy called Wesley. She said yes, and told me some very weird things about him. She said that he was a very controlling person. He would call her every hour to check where she was, and he'd get angry whenever she spoke to another man. Wesley became insanely obsessed with her, which led to an incident that shook her up pretty good. Weeks after she dumped him, Ruby recalled waking up in the middle of the night and seeing Wesley standing over her bed. A deranged smile morphing onto his face as he stared at her. Ruby called the police right after he left, and Wesley was arrested for breaking into her house in the early hours of the morning. Ruby claimed she hadn't seen him since that night, which was 2 years ago. Very concerned, I told my boss Jim about Wesley's history. He gave me his word that if Wesley caused any sort of trouble, he'd let him go. A few weeks passed, me and Ruby got engaged. I proposed to her while we were walking through the local park. I pretended that there was something wrong with my knee, then I pulled out the ring, as her eyes teared up. I never pictured myself as the marrying type, but then Ruby came into my life and changed that. The day after I got engaged, I walked into my place of work, and immediately was greeted with Wesley getting up in my face, making violent threats. He clearly knew of Ruby and I's engagement, and was irate about it. How he found out, I have no idea. He said that he and Ruby belonged together and that I was merely a distraction. I couldn't believe how delusional this guy was. My boss Jim came storming out of the kitchen. He pointed at the door and told Wesley to leave, and never come back. Wesley stood there for a moment, seemingly trying to process what he just heard. A tear rolled down his cheek, as he gave my boss and I a bone-chilling stare before exiting the premise. I felt relieved that I wasn't gonna have to work with him anymore, but there was a smidge of fear lurking within me. His threats loomed in my mind. I honestly wasn't sure how serious he was about them. 2 nights later, I was woken up in the middle of the night by someone knocking aggressively at my front door. I went downstairs and opened the door to see who it was, but there was nobody there. Initially I thought it was some kids playing ding dong ditch, so I went back to bed and didn't overthink it. The very next night, I was once again woken up from my sleep. This time by insufferable screams. I walked over to my bedroom window and looked out of it. Wesley was standing in the middle of the street, screaming at the top of his lungs. He was still wearing his Domino's uniform, which I thought was strange, given that he didn't work there anymore. I was gonna open the window and tell him to get out of here, but then I glanced down at the palms of his hands and noticed that they were completely covered in blood. Wesley looked up at my bedroom window and started laughing uncontrollably. The visual of this was beyond disturbing. I felt so intimidated. I picked up my phone and started dialing 911. As I got through to the operator, I noticed the screams had stopped. I looked back at the window. Wesley was gone. I reported the incident to the police and they said they'd investigate the situation further. A day had passed and I luckily hadn't been woken up by any weird occurrences the night before. I thought the cops had scared off Wesley, so I was ready to put the whole thing behind me. Then I got a phone call that sent chills raging throughout my entire body. An officer finally got back to me. I asked if Wesley had been arrested, and he said no. The officer proceeded to tell me that he and a colleague went to Wesley's address earlier that day. To their surprise, what they found was a decomposing body, and it fit Wesley's description. The officer said that he looked to have been dead for almost a week and the cause of death seemed to be suicide by cutting off the wrists. I was floored by what he told me. If Wesley had been dead for that long, then it couldn't have been him standing outside my house that night, could it? I didn't know what to think. I felt like I was losing my grasp with reality. Later that night, as I laid in my bed, struggling to get some sleep, I heard the familiar knocking, only it wasn't coming from the front door this time, it was coming from my bedroom door. Fear froze me in my bed. I thought I was imagining things, until the door slowly opened. When I heard the last creak, I expected to see someone standing in the doorway, but I didn't. I laid in my bed not moving a muscle, hoping that there was some logical explanation for this. But that hope was incinerated, when Wesley's laughter started to fill the room. I wanted to say something, but I was so scared that I couldn't. My attention was drawn to the dark corner of my room. In it were a pair of glowing white eyes, watching me from within the darkness. Wesley started to emerge. His face was as white as the bed sheets I laid in. His slit wrists were riddled with maggots and his blonde streaked hair was draped over his face. Wesley's terrifying smile sent my heart into overdrive. I thought I was gonna have a heart attack. Then in front of my very eyes, he disappeared. At this point I couldn't tell what was real anymore. I got up from my bed, walked out of the house, and started running as fast as I could with no clear destination. As I write this story, I'm currently residing at a mental institution. Nobody believed me when I told them the ghost of Wesley Nolan haunts me. Well, except for Ruby. She told me she had been experiencing similar things, but didn't say anything to anyone after seeing what happened to me. Then about a month ago, the worst possible thing happened. Ruby was found dead in her bed. Her wrists had been cut, so the assumed cause of death was suicide, but I knew she would never do something like that. Wesley did this, I know he did. He took the one truly great thing in my life away from me. Now I have nothing left. In my heart, I know that Wesley will be the death of me, but he's clearly intent on making me suffer first. I just wish he'd get it over with already.